Good afternoon. I am Heather Herring, the Education Manager at the Northeast Resource Recovery Association. I want to warmly welcome you to our summer webinar series. Today, we will explore extended producer responsibility. Next slide, please. Do you need professional credits? You can receive 1 hour of professional development credit by participating in this live webinar and completing the short survey at the end. Our webinars are being recorded and will be made available for those who registered. Continue your learning with these webinars all summer long. Please visit our new website at NRRA-recycles.org for additional information. Next slide. We have some information on webinars. For recycling facility operators, we have operator track webinars from which to choose from. And now the rest of them from June and July and August are recorded on our new website. Next slide, please. And for our educators, administrators, and community members, we have our community track webinars. We've separated our webinars according to probable interest groups, but all NRRA members and not yet members are welcome to participate in any and all of our webinar offerings. Next slide. Next slide, please. I'd like to set the table for GoToWebinar. Webinar participants will not be able to be heard by the presenters or other participants during the presentation. If you cannot hear the presenters' voices, please click on the audio arrow in your control panel and choose computer audio. If that does not work, select the phone call option and follow the directions. We hope that you will ask questions and our presenters will do their best to answer them as time allows. Click on the question block in the control panel and type in your questions, and please keep your questions short and to the point. I would also like to bring your attention to that this will be recorded and put on our website. So you, in a day or two, you'll find it on our website for those who have missed it. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's a bit about the Northeast Resource Recovery Association. We are a recycling nonprofit, and we have 400 members, primarily municipalities, and we were founded nearly 40 years ago. Next slide. So what do? We do cooperative marketing and purchasing. We enable communities to manage their own recycling programs, and we offer over 40 programs, including single stream and municipal solid waste. We connect sellers of recyclables to purchasers. Next slide. We provide education and technical assistance through workshops, facility tours, annual conference, and for this year, webinars like these, technical assistance, and a school club. Next slide. And now I would like to introduce our presenters for today, Megan Pryor, who's an environmental specialist for the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, and Terri Goldberg, the Executive Director of the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association, NRRA. And I believe Megan will be presenting first. On behalf of NRRA, I'd like to welcome you to the summer webinar series and turn the presentation over to Megan. Welcome.
Great, thanks, Heather. My name is Megan Pryor, and I work for the Maine Department of Environmental Protection in our Division of Materials Management, and I'm just going to go over the product stewardship programs that we have in Maine and share some general thoughts on EPR policy tools. Next slide, please. So first, I just want to touch on product stewardship and EPR. The terms are sometimes used interchangeably. But product stewardship is the act of minimizing the health, safety, environmental, and social impacts of a product or packaging throughout its entire life cycle, so from extraction to resources, all the way through transportation, use, and end-of-life management. And product stewardship programs can be either a voluntary initiative or a mandatory initiative, whereas extended producer responsibility, or EPR laws, create mandatory product stewardship, and that holds manufacturers responsible for helping to manage the products that they produce at end of life. And that can help to mitigate that disconnect that just sometimes naturally occurs between producers and that process of dealing with end of life management of products. Next slide, please. So some of the drivers for EPR certain waste materials are just more difficult to manage, and that's often due to inherent product characteristics. So one of the positive aspects of EPR is that the program can include financial incentives to design products or packaging to be less toxic or otherwise easier to manage at end of life, perhaps more readily recyclable. So when the cost of that end-of-life management is paid up front, it ensures that there will be sufficient resources when it comes time to manage either disposal or recycling of that product, and that the cost doesn't just fall on the general tax-paying base. Because unfortunately, especially these days, there may and often are inadequate resources at the municipal level, such as money or just availability of end markets for dealing with certain materials and products. So EPR can help relieve some of that financial burden that falls on the public sector when it comes to end-of-life product management. Next slide, please. Another positive aspect of the EPR programs that we have in Maine is that they help to reduce risk. A lot of the products that we have EPR programs for have some of those inherent characteristics, like they're combustible or they contain toxins such as lead, mercury, cadmium, lithium, brominated flame retardants, phosphorus coatings, or PVC plastics. A lot of our MSW in Maine ends up in a waste to energy facility, so PVC plastics are a material you want to keep out of there. They can create dioxins if they're burned. So the EPR programs that we have provide either free or low-cost options for our residents and municipalities to help manage those materials, which in turn, if you make it easier, it reduces the risk that some of those toxins will be released into the environment. It also reduces the risk of fire, damage, or injury that can happen during collection and disposal. Like, for example, you don't want a lithium-ion battery ending up in the curbside recycling stream. It also can increase the recycling of materials that might otherwise be disposed of improperly. Our e-waste program, for example, ensures that all the materials that are collected get recycled to the maximum extent. Next slide, please. So this slide just shows all the different products that we have programs for in Maine. Some of them are stewardship laws, some of them are just take-back mandates, and I'll touch on a little bit more detail on how the different programs work later in the presentation. Next slide, please. We also have a framework law in Maine, our product stewardship framework, and this is used so that when a product arises as a potential that might benefit from EPR, we can use our framework to assess whether or not that product might be a good fit for an EPR program. So the first thing that we look at is whether there is an existing EPR program for that product in another place. So we look at other countries, provinces, and states, and we look at their laws and how they're working. We also look at toxins. If the product contains toxins that would pose health and environmental risks if that product isn't managed properly at end of life. We look at whether EPR programs can reduce the financial burden on taxpayers and municipalities. We also look at what's out there right now for voluntary programs and whether there are gaps or whether voluntary programs are perhaps able to better manage the material. And then number 5, we look at whether EPR could increase recovery and recycling of materials. Next slide, please. So as an example, these are some of the products that have been considered in Maine for EPR programs in the past several years. And this just is an example of how each product aligns with the framework criteria. And just a note on the asterisk next to carpet for contains toxics. Generally, carpet does not meet that criteria, but there have been some research studies testing different carpets, and they have found that certain carpets do contain PFAS or phthalates, and those are obviously products that you don't want young children crawling around on the floor in particular. So some carpets may actually meet that criteria. Next slide, please. So to touch in a little bit more detail on the different programs that we have and how they work, our bottle bill was our first program, and this was actually implemented as a litter reduction program. It wasn't so much an effort to increase recycling. It was really meant to kind of keep those beverage containers reined in from being littered all over the place, and it has been successful at that. Not that they do not still end up sometimes littered, but they tend to be picked up because there's a financial reward for turning them in. So with this program, consumers pay a refundable deposit of between 5 and 15 cents on a beverage container. It covers most beverages. The exception is local apple ciders and blueberry beverages and milk. But everything else is covered. So spirits, wine, alcoholic and non-alcoholic, carbonated and non-carbonated. And our program is also broad in that it covers a variety of container sizes. So everything from those tiny little 50 milliliter nips all the way up to 4-liter bottles are covered. So it's a comprehensive bill, and we have estimated recovery rates of somewhere between 75 and 87%. It's difficult to get an exact number on that, but the recycling rate is estimated to be quite high. And when you compare that to the national recycling rate of somewhere around 34%, it's considered to be a very successful program. And this little diagram to the side here just gives you an idea of how the money flows through the system to keep that container moving through the system, incentivizing recycling. Next slide, please. Our next program is our electronic waste or e-waste program. And the way this works in Maine is manufacturers pay to recycle covered electronic devices, and they have to register to sell those into the state of Maine. You can see what's covered by this law at the bottom of the slide there. It's printers, video game consoles, cathode ray tubes, so the old bulky CRT televisions and computer monitors, and other devices that have display screens more than 4 inches across diagonally and 1 or more circuit boards. So residents, elementary and secondary schools, and any nonprofit or small business with 100 and fewer employees can recycle through the e-waste stewardship program for low to no cost in Maine. And municipalities are responsible for providing the collection sites or events, and they can also charge a small fee to cover their own costs for managing the materials, which is an important aspect of the program, because in some cases with some of the EPR programs, the municipalities provide residents with free recycling, but they don't have a means to cover their own cost. For example, with our Mercury Lamp program, which I'll talk about a bit more, they have to take the materials in for free, which is great because it's free. It encourages residents to recycle, but in some cases it may be a drawback for the transfer station or municipal site because they can't cover their own labor costs. So that's just something to consider when you're thinking about different EPR programs. Next slide, please. We also have a rechargeable battery stewardship program in Maine. The law is coming up on 20 years old next year, and it requires manufacturers to pay for nickel, cadmium, and small sealed lead acid battery recycling. So when the law was written, some of the more prevalent battery chemistries that are around today, especially lithium ion, were not in use or not widespread use. And the program that is in Maine run by Call to Recycle thankfully accepts a much wider range of rechargeable batteries through the program than what's required by our law. And we have voluntary participation for collection of batteries in Maine with a lot of transfer stations, municipalities, and some retail stores that participate to collect. One thing that we find is likely is confusion over the battery types is probably leading to disposal of batteries that could be recycled. And one reason I say this, if you look at Vermont's program, that graph there shows their battery collections. They implemented a primary battery stewardship program. So their rechargeable battery collection is run voluntarily through Call to Recycle, but once they implemented mandatory primary battery collection, you can see that their overall battery collections increased significantly for both primary and rechargeable. So it seems likely that if you eliminate that confusion and consumers just know if they have a battery they can recycle it, you will see overall increased amounts of recycling and collection. In Maine, the residents do not have to recycle rechargeable batteries by law, but businesses are required to. Next slide, please. We also have a take back mandate for cell phones, and this is a pretty basic program. If a retailer is selling cell phones in the store, they have to also take them back for free recycling and provide some sort of signage in the store that lets customers know that they can bring cell phones in for free for recycling. And we also have a disposal on cell phones. This isn't a program that we put a lot of a tracking on. We don't have reporting or anything, but it seems to be running fairly smoothly. Next slide, please. For our Mercury Thermostat and Auto Switch program, these are run similarly, and the manufacturers pay to collect and recycle the devices. These both of these type of devices contain quite a bit of mercury. There's several grams in the ampules that are contained in the products, and so this is something we really want to keep out in the environment. Manufacturers also pay a financial incentive to consumers in Maine to recycle these products. So anyone in Maine that turns in a Mercury thermostat for recycling is eligible for a $5 incentive, and that might be a store credit at a hardware store or a $5 rebate from the manufacturers. In addition, Maine scrap recyclers and vehicle dismantlers have a $4 incentive for every Mercury auto switch that they collect. And through this program, all collection sites get all the supplies that they need to safely store and ship the materials, and it's all compliant with universal waste shipping requirements and to receive and process those reimbursements. Next slide, please. Our Mercury Lamp program. This one is the costs of the program are internalized by the manufacturers, so there's no visible fee at sale. I think Washington State has a program where the Mercury Lamp program is funded by fee at sale. This one is different. It's completely internalized. Anyone in Maine can recycle unlimited CFLs, the compact fluorescent lamps, but are limited to only 10 other mercury-containing lamps per visit to a participating drop-off site. We have municipalities, some transfer stations, as well as retail stores, usually hardware stores, that also participate voluntarily to serve as collection sites for the public to bring in their bulbs for this program. We have noticed that because of that limitation on how many non-CFL bulbs can be brought in at any one time, while that works well for retail stores where they might not want to get overwhelmed with people bringing in a large number of, for example, the 8-foot tubes, it tends to discourage some of our municipal sites from participating in the program because they obviously are equipped for handling larger quantities of materials and find it difficult to manage because any lamp brought in excess of the 10 has to be managed separately and paid for through a different system. So this program we tend to see less participation in because of some of those limitations. Collection sites, again, in this program, they get all the materials that they need to safely store and ship the lamps in compliance with regulations. Next slide, please. And then our newest program is for architectural paint. And this program is not funded by the manufacturers, it's funded by consumers. Every time you buy a paint in Maine, with the exception of a very small container, there's a small fee for oil-based and latex paint that covers the cost of this program. And brands and manufacturers have to register to sell their paint into Maine. And again, the infrastructure, the collection infrastructure for this program is entirely voluntary. So again, we have a lot of transfer stations and retail stores. With most of the stewardship programs, it's limited to hardware stores, but this one, the Sherwin-Williams and other paint stores also participate in the program. And one positive aspect of this is we've noted from multiple participants that serve as collection sites, a lot of the retail stores have indicated that they've either seen increased business or have heard a lot of really positive feedback from customers that they're participating in this program, and they really appreciate the service. This program also has an option to reuse paint, but that has been, it's been slower to be adopted because there's some record keeping that can be, some retail stores in particular are reluctant to take on that record keeping, but in addition, the pandemic has obviously put a damper on a lot of reuse initiatives in general. It might be slow to be adopted for that reason as well in the coming years. Next slide, please. So just some closing thoughts on EPR programs in general. Some of the things that we've noticed with what makes a program succeed is considering the financial incentives. So that might be whether do the entities that are collecting the products from the public, are they going to benefit from their participation? Will they either be paid for their services, or might they, like with the pain care program, have increased business or customer appreciation from their serving as a collection site? Another thing to consider, like with the Mercury thermostats and auto switches, is there an incentive for consumers to recycle the material instead of throwing them in the trash? Particularly if it's something that's very toxic, an incentive can be a good way to keep those materials from ending up in the environment. Another thing to consider is design incentives that can help a program have better environmental outcomes. So setting minimum requirements for non-toxic and recyclable design or recycled content. And if there are eco-modulated fees, that can also encourage manufacturers to go beyond the minimum requirement. So for example, you might have a 10% minimum recycled content requirement, but then have a financial incentive. So perhaps a manufacturer pays less if they are putting in a higher amount of recycled content in their product. So those are just some things to think about. And that is all I have for this presentation. Thank you. My contact information is there if anyone wants to reach out directly with questions.
Thank you so much, Megan. I very much appreciate the presentation. I want to turn it over to Terri now, and we'll take questions at the end for both of you, okay?
Thank you, Megan, and thank you, Heather. I apologize, Megan, for advancing some slides a little prematurely. I hope it didn't disrupt things too much. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be joining this webinar and to be working with Maine DEP and NRRA on this webinar this afternoon. In a little bit, I'll try to remember to explain what NRRA is, but I'm going to talk a little more broadly about EPR programs in other parts of the Northeast US. I'm going to provide a little bit of an overview of those programs. I'm going to talk particularly about 3 programs that Megan didn't talk about, just as a contrast. I'm going to talk about packaging and paper products, EPR, mattresses, and pharmaceutical take-back. So this slide presents an overview of the states in the Northeast that I'm going to talk about today. That includes the states in New England plus New York. New York has been a very active state with EPR legislation, as you can see from this slide. As you can see, Maine and Vermont also have very robust EPR programs. And we've already heard about the Maine program. Vermont also has some of the same programs. And Megan talked a little bit about their battery programs. So you can see that we have some very active states in this region. I'd say the Northeast US is one of the most active regions in the US on EPR legislation. And we continue to see every day more and more interest in EPR legislation in some of the states. And we can talk about sort of some of what may be happening in the future when the legislatures get back to work, hopefully in the coming year. So some of the recently proposed EPR bills in the region. So the previous slide was laws that have been enacted. These are products for which EPR has been recently proposed and not yet enacted. You can see there's still pretty active interest in legislation in Maine related to packaging, batteries, pharmaceuticals, and tobacco products. And we can talk a little more about some of that if you're interested. Massachusetts has a number of proposals. Massachusetts has not enacted very much EPR legislation, but they have had a number of proposals, and that's been an ongoing focus in Massachusetts. I'd say in Massachusetts, they're particularly organizations like Mass Recycle, which is a recycling organization, a statewide recycling organization. They've been particularly interested in pursuing EPR for mattresses. There's been, for a number of years, a proposal in Maine to enact paint EPR. You can see there's a lot of proposals in New York still, and New York has a number of programs already, and a focus in Vermont on household hazardous waste in particular, and that's kind of unique in Vermont that they're interested in trying to pursue EPR for household hazardous waste. So NRRA has been partnering with a sister organization called NERC, or the Northeast Recycling Council, to prepare a number of publications related to EPR for packaging and paper products. NRRA and NERC are both regional entities covering most of the Northeast US. NRRA's membership includes all of New England, New York, and New Jersey. We work on a range of solid waste, hazardous waste, waste site cleanup, and toxics programs. NRRA is also a regional organization. Its geographic area includes the same area as NMOA, but also Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland. So it has a bigger geographic range. And we've been collaborating on a number of initiatives over the last 4 or 5 years, including this one. We have a regional network that we formed of both state entities, state agencies, but also some of the non-governmental organizations in the region who are very active on extended producer responsibility. And so one of the questions that we get a lot is about what is EPR for packaging and paper products. And so we developed this fact sheet, which just covers what the basics are. We produced a white paper that is a much more extensive discussion of the EPR proposals in the region and some of the background information on the existing programs in other parts of the world. And also a set of sort of questions that come up about extended producer for responsibility for packaging and paper products. Unlike a lot of the programs we've been talking about so far in this webinar, you could imagine that EPR for packaging and paper products could have a really profound effect on the way we manage municipal solid waste generally going into the future, because packaging and paper products is such a huge portion of our municipal solid waste. So I urge you to take a look at those papers if you're particularly interested in this this topic and where this topic might be going. I should hasten to say that so far in this region, there are no actual EPR programs for packaging and paper products, but there are proposals to enact legislation, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But I thought this would illustrate a little bit about the difference between the financing of traditional packaging and paper product end-of-life systems between what we have now and what we might have under some kind of EPR system. So, you know, under the current system, you know, residents and taxpayers generate waste. They fund the municipal programs or the private subscription programs, however they are operated, either curbside or through transfer stations. Those, you know, those municipal programs or private subscription programs fund the hauler. The hauler then, you know, takes the material for disposal or to a MRF for recovery. And then obviously the MRF is involved in transactions with the end markets for the recycled materials. So that should be a fairly familiar scenario for anyone who's involved in that system. Under EPR for packaging and paper products, we have the consumer who pays for the product, buys the product. Under the schemes for packaging and paper products, because we don't pay, you know, we don't pay for packaging the way we pay for, you know, a lamp or a thermostat or paint, et cetera, mattresses. The cost for the EPR program would be entirely internalized. There's no added fee on the product. The cost per unit of packaging for under an EPR program is estimated to be in the pennies. So in all scenarios, the costs are internalized, so the consumer pays when they buy the product with the packaging on it. Obviously, those funds are paid to the brand owner or manufacturer. They then create a structure for administering the EPR program. That's usually called a PRO, Producer Responsibility Organization. There may be different terminologies, but the producers generally get together, create a PRO that then manages the EPR system. So those funds go to this entity, this PRO. Then they fund both the MRF and the municipalities and hauler activities, and then the MRFs or the disposal facilities deal with the end markets. So you can see that the financing of this is very different with the insertion of the manufacturers and the brand owners and the creation of this EPR organization to manage the actual flow of materials. One of the important differences among the different sort of models for EPR programs that we see around the US and all over the world is the relationship between the producer responsibility organization or the administrator of the EPR system and the municipality and the hauler. How much control of the actual collection of the materials, how involved are the municipalities and the existing haulers in that system. That's something that is often an important part of the structure of the law and the way the program is implemented. So as I alluded to, there's been really worldwide adoption of EPR for paper products and packaging. Almost all of the European Union countries and many Asian countries and 5 Canadian provinces manage packaging now through EPR. And in Europe and Asia, it's mostly focused on packaging, and Canada includes also paper products. So, you know, there are different configurations of what packaging and paper products are covered under these different laws around the world. In our region, there are proposals in the legislatures in Maine, Massachusetts, and New York for EPR for packaging and paper products. And if you're interested, we could talk a little more in depth about those proposals. As I said, when considering establishing an EPR program for these materials, you know, there are, you know, really important conversations and discussions about whether manufacturers are given complete financial and operational responsibility for establishing and maintaining this recycling system, and that's often called full manufacturer responsibility, or whether that responsibility is shared with municipalities, and sort of how those responsibilities are structured is an important consideration in drafting and designing these laws. It's also very important, and I think you heard this a lot from Megan already, that it's really important, we think, for building in incentives for the use of recyclable packaging and disincentives for the use of non-recyclable packaging when designing these laws. So that comes into play a lot in the way the fees are modulated for the manufacturers and brand owners in the design of these laws and programs. So some of the major elements to consider for the packaging and paper product programs is, obviously, it's important to think about what materials and products are covered. I already mentioned that in some jurisdictions, the focus is only on packaging, in some it's both packaging and paper products. How is it structured from financing to collection? We've already alluded to that a little bit. Obviously, the program really needs to clearly distinguish the roles of the existing municipal collection system, the haulers and MRFs. That's a critical part of any design for these EPR programs. What is the oversight by government entities of the system and its operations? We can talk more about this. Certainly, Megan's very familiar with this since she has a lot of responsibility for oversight of the program she described. But, you know, what kind of reporting is involved? What kind of annual oversight is done by the government entities? Is there any requirements for auditing or compliance checks? All of those are important aspects of designing any of these programs. And then setting performance measures and incentives. Maybe that's obvious, but it's very important to outline what the goals of the programs are, what they're trying to achieve. Are they trying to set a certain goal for, you know, percent recycled of the materials? What are the incentives for both making sure that the materials are recyclable or use recycled content? All of those are considerations in designing these programs. So we see a lot of benefits to having EPR for paper and packaging products, paper products and packaging and paper products. You know, most critical, especially right now, given what we're experiencing, you know, under the pandemic, is the infusion of dedicated non-taxpayer funding to sustainably support recovery and recycling and disposal if that's necessary. We think that this could create a more consistent and predictable system that enables states and possibly regions to take a more unified approach to strategic planning around recycling. You know, one of the things, at least at NMOA, that we hear all the time is a lot of public confusion about the fact that you go to different areas or different jurisdictions and they collect different materials for recycling, or, you know, some areas they collect some types of plastic, other areas they don't. For example, where are they collecting glass? This is very confusing to the public. You know, it's confusing to the public to understand what's recyclable and what is not, particularly around plastics. So, you know, we think that a lot of having an EPR system would create a lot more consistent messaging and education around what's recyclable. We think that it could lead to increased investments in the end markets and the recycling infrastructure. That's really critical right now. And we, you know, we've talked about this, but also the importance of the incentives for producer to improve the design of their packaging in particular, so that it's more recyclable and environmentally friendly. So let's talk a little bit about mattresses now. Mattresses, if any of you are involved in your transfer stations or curbside collection, you know that mattresses really present huge challenges because of their size, their bulkiness, their, you know, the difficulty with the, you know, any kind of use of them in incineration or landfilling them. But we generate a lot of mattresses in the US, and it's both residential, businesses, schools, etc. Not a high percentage of these recycled mattresses are recycled, less than 5%. But we know that a lot of their components can be made, can be recycled into steel products, carpet padding, animal bedding, and mulch. There's a lot of uses of the components of mattresses. But a lot of people have no convenient way to recycle their mattresses. So they do end up in disposal. We often see mattresses illegally dumped, and they really are expensive for local governments to manage. So there are EPR laws now for mattresses. These laws require mattress companies to establish and operate recycling programs that make it easy for consumers to recycle their mattresses. These laws are now in place in California, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. So obviously there's been a growing use of these programs in the region. I mentioned that there is a proposal for mattress, at least a study of mattress EPR in Massachusetts, and it's been under discussion in some of the other states that I showed you at the beginning of my presentation. So what are some of the key programs in mattress EPR? The program is funded by consumers paying what a lot of people call an eco fee on the sale of the mattresses. So when you buy a mattress in the states that have these programs, you pay an additional fee that then goes to a producer responsibility organization that ultimately manages the system for handling the mattresses at end of life. Brands and manufacturers register with the state so that it's clear who all the participants are in these programs. The municipalities and retail stores participate in collection programs voluntarily. Many retail stores that sell mattresses already will collect old mattresses when they come to install a new mattress for a resident. So, you know, their participation, you know, their infrastructure is already in place. There's an organization called the Mattress Recycling Council, which is now providing the PRO support for this program, and they're working with the states that have these mandates and are to implement the programs. And from discussions that I've had, with all of the state officials involved in these programs, they consider it to be very successful. So a little more about the mattress recycling organization. It was formed by the industry to support these programs. The industry has been, or at least a lot of the industry has been in favor of these programs. They do a lot of, MRC does a lot of education about these laws. They help retailers and manufacturers with their registration and reporting obligations. They work closely with local governments, waste management professionals, recyclers, and others to support mattress collection and recycling. So what are the benefits of this program? They really gives local governments a lot of relief from managing this bulky waste. In Connecticut, the municipalities have saved nearly $1.5 million in mattress disposal costs in 1 year. It reduces greenhouse gas emissions and energy use in large part because it increases the recycling of the mattress materials. It does provide a flow of high quality materials for recycling, and it encourages investments in more local recycling. It's very expensive to haul mattresses any distance. So, there really is much more encouragement of creation of the local infrastructure for recycling, and associated with that is the creation of local recycling jobs. So I'm going to transition now to pharmaceuticals. I would say pharmaceuticals are a growing area for EPR, but because of the nature of pharmaceuticals, it's different than the other kinds of products we've been talking about today so far. We know that when we throw away pharmaceuticals in the trash or flush them down the toilet, or they end up down the drain, they can end up in landfills, sewage systems, wastewater treatment facilities. And those facilities are not equipped to remove them. They're not designed to remove the pharmaceuticals from the wastewater or the landfill leachate. And so when they enter this way of getting into the environment, they can enter the waterways, and then they can become a problem to wildlife or become a contaminant in drinking water. We also know that people store pharmaceuticals in their home, and particularly for certain types of pharmaceuticals, they can therefore end up in the wrong hands, leading to drug abuse, misuse, or accidental poisoning. We know that many prescription drugs, and we're talking principally about opioids here, often people who abuse prescription drugs get them from their friends or families, and often from the medicine cabinet. So there's, in this case, really a crying public health problem that these EPR programs are designed to help to address. So far in our region, Massachusetts and New York have enacted laws. The Massachusetts law is in effect and collection is occurring, but there have been amendments that have been proposed to the Massachusetts law. The New York State Health Department is developing regulations covering the implementation of the drug take-back program in New York State. Those regulations, as far as I know, are still in some kind of review at the Health Department. You can imagine how distracted the New York Health Department is by COVID-19. So there's been really significant delays in in finalizing their regulations. And recently there was a call by a number of the national and state EPR groups in New York to have the Health Department finalize and issue these regulations and get this program going. In Massachusetts, the program enables residents to dispose of unused and expired medications completely safely, confidentially, and free at various types of locations, including health centers, pharmacies, hospitals, or drug collection kiosks at police stations. You may have been participating. There's been for a number of years sort of voluntary pharmaceutical collections, often through police stations, or at least at a location where there is a police officer. And this has been necessary because of the fact that they're collecting a wide range of pharmaceuticals, including, opioids and other, drugs that are we want to take particular care of. You can see the list of what's collected at these sites. These programs do not cover things like needles and sharps, thermometers, blood or infectious waste, and aerosol cans. So I will say about the pharmaceutical programs, the pharmaceuticals that are collected there's not recycling of pharmaceuticals. That's not legal. So the pharmaceuticals are collected and they are disposed of through some kind of incineration process. And that's, sort of how what we consider to be the safest sort of end of life management of the pharmaceuticals. So if you're more interested in more information about any number of these programs or more information on EPR and product stewardship generally, I certainly recommend the Product Stewardship Institute, that's PSI, and their website. It has a wealth of information. You can check out NUMOA's website. You can check out the National Stewardship Action Council website, also a very active organization on a variety of EPR programs. They're really based in California, and so they have a big focus on the California program. So if you're interested in that, they're doing a lot right now on tobacco waste, which I know that Megan sort of touched on that very briefly in one of her slides. And of course, our colleagues at NRRA, they also have a lot of information on EPR and have been working on this issue regionally. So I'm happy to answer any questions. And again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to present today.
And thank you so much, Terry, for your presentation, and Megan as well. I've learned a lot. We have a couple of questions that came in. First, I'm going to turn to Megan. We have a question that came in. Can you provide some information about Maine's EPR initiative for consumer packaging?
Sure. Well, I'm not sure what to target the information for the question, but if the goal is to learn more about what the program might look like, the idea is that the producer would distribute the packaging, and then when it comes to end of life, there would be multiple options. So if it's readily recyclable packaging, the producer could choose to collect and manage that packaging on their own. They could set up their own separate collection system. If they do not want to be involved with the actual collection, then they can reimburse municipalities for the recycling, and that would be based on the per ton cost of the previous year's activities. So there would be some, a bit of variation there with the markets. If the packaging is not recyclable, then the manufacturer would reimburse the municipality for disposal cost. Excellent. And it would actually be a greater cost. It would be 200% of, sorry, I don't want to say this correctly, 200% of the cost of the most expensive material or the municipal disposal cost. So there's some, I can't get into all of the details of it, but there's some eco-modulation there. So there's incentives for designing package that's more recyclable. I'd be happy to share some information via email because there's a lot to the bill.
Sure. I mean, I know here at NRRA, we get questions all the time from operators. They receive something in the facility and they're like, what do I do with this? It has two numbers in the bottom of the plastic bottle. What do we do? So having, kickback programs and clarity from producers, of course, would help. I have another question for both Megan and Terry. It says, besides increasing recyclability or reducing toxicity of products, do you think that EPR programs might create an incentive for producers to focus more on source reduction in their production process? Or would source reduction more likely stem from a company's natural instinct to reduce production costs, thinner, water bottles, beverage cans, etc.? So, Terry, do you want to start with that?
Sure, thank you. Well, I think that there are, under the programs where we're mandating changes in the toxins in products, I think there certainly would have ramifications for what occurs in the manufacturing process. So, for example, you heard Megan talk about programs to reduce the use of mercury in thermostats or lamps and that kind of thing. In some cases, those laws have associated requirements, particularly in states like Maine, but other states in the region, for reducing the use of those toxic chemicals in the products in the first place. And in those cases, those will definitely have beneficial impacts in terms of reduced toxins in the manufacturing process. I think that, Megan may know more about this, but I don't know whether things like EPR for packaging and paper products have the kinds of sort of knockoff effects in terms of what happens in the manufacturing of those products. Clearly, if there's incentives to use more recycled content or make products more recyclable, that will affect what happens in the manufacturing of those products and the materials used in manufacturing. I think this is an important question to think about, and I guess I don't know enough about whether that's been studied in Europe or Canada yet. Megan, maybe you can comment on that to sort of have some perspective on it.
Well, in terms of what they've looked at in Europe, I am not the lead on the packaging program, so I'm not able to say on that. In terms of what we're looking at with our program, source reduction is less of a priority than recyclability. And I'm inclined to lean toward the second option there, where you suggested that source reduction would more likely stem from a company's natural instinct to reduce their own production cost. But I mean, frankly, what we wouldn't want to see is a great increase in lightweight packaging that is not recyclable and has greater potential to end up in the environment. It's probably less of a problem in developed countries, but one of the issues with plastics getting out into the environment, a lot of it has been some of that lightweight packaging that is, more likely to be carried by the elements and end up in the environment. So source reduction has some limitations if it's not able to be managed properly.
Of course. So I have a general question for both of you, which is, if you had a company come to you and say, okay, we're looking about, redesign of our packaging, what advice would you give them?
Well, there are a number of companies that are making commitments publicly, a number of packaging manufacturers who are, or big brands that are making commitments these days to increase the recycled content of their packaging or make it more recyclable. I think that there are a number of interesting challenges with some of that. I think some of the brands that are making big commitments to increase the recycled content of their packaging realize that they need to then have really steady and consistent sources of the materials, which then incentivizes them to get more involved on the collection side. And in some cases, I think has made them take a second look at EPR, whereas in the past, I think they were, there was a lot of opposition. Some of them have realized that EPR really does provide a much more consistent and steady stream of materials, just like the bottle bill programs do. So I think there's a really interesting dynamic happening and conversations that are underway that I really think are beginning to change sort of the viewpoint of many stakeholders on these programs. I don't know, Megan, what your perspective is.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. The other thing I would add is that there are a lot of resources out there. If a company is interested in making their packaging more recyclable, depending on what the material is made for, there's Association of Plastics Recyclers has a Design for Recycling guide. There's also, if you look at that, there's a label, the How to Recycle label, and the packaging that has that label on it has to be certified to be recyclable. It's based on the FDA Green Guide standard. So if a package is recyclable, I think the threshold is 60% of the US, then it can have the recyclable label on it. So it can be easy to find good examples of packaging that is recyclable in most of the US, and to find information from recyclers about what is and isn't recyclable.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you both. Megan, I have a question specifically for you. Can you provide some information Oh, do you think, let's see, is there any information whether Maine's legislature will come back for a special session and take up the proposed packaging EPR legislation?
Well, it's possible that the legislature will reconvene for an emergency session, but in terms of taking up the packaging EPR bill, I suppose that will depend. I think the idea is that they will be focusing on the very highest priority bills, and I'm not, to be honest, I'm not certain where this would fall among the slate of bills lined up for them to consider.
Sure, certainly understood. Those are all the questions that I have coming in at this time, but it is definitely an area of interest for many, for operators, consumers, producers, etc. So definitely an interesting conversation that will continue. I want to thank you both, Megan and Terry, for your time. And I also want to go to the next slide, please. I want to thank our sponsors for today for the summer webinar series. We'd like to thank the Interstate Refrigerant Recovery Incorporated, Schnitzer, and the USDA. And I want to remind everyone that post the webinar, there will be a post-webinar survey, which will launch immediately after the webinar. It'll also appear in your email inbox tomorrow. As a reminder, we welcome feedback. Next slide, please. Our webinar series will continue on Friday, August 28th at noon, where we will explore we need to think about clothing differently with Joe Whitten, the CEO of Apparel Impact. So that's about recycling clothing. And then next Wednesday, September 2nd at 9 a.m., we will look at tricks of the trade for our operators with Joni Cudworth, Director of Public Works in Hollis, New Hampshire, Brian Patno, Recycling Manager in Littleton, New Hampshire, and Ed Walsh, Transfer Station Manager in Rollinsford, New Hampshire. So again, I want to thank you all for joining us today and have a happy summer from NRRA.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
Sure.